What's up, guys? It's Mitch with Respect My Region back with the RMR podcast for episode 11. Today, my co-host Joey Bravo is stuck in traffic somewhere in LA, which has happened once or twice on this podcast before, but it's inevitable living in LA and when you're apparently live on the road. Today, I have a very special guest. I have David Abernathy from the Arcview Group joining me. Thanks for joining, David.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome, man. Awesome. So, could you give our listeners a little bit of an introduction to yourself and your background in the cannabis space?
Sure. So I'm a principal at Arcview Management Consulting, and I've been in the cannabis industry for about 12 years now. I've been with Arcview for the better part of 8. In addition to the consulting that I do, I also sit on the board of the Arcview Group, as well as the Minority Cannabis Business Association Marijuana Policy Project, and several organizations outside of cannabis. I also teach economics of cannabis at Oaksterdam University.
And so, being as involved in cannabis you are, why cannabis? What initially attracted you to this space?
Yeah, so early on, I was just a cannabis consumer, and really, my cannabis journey started when I met a guy who moved in next door to me in Oakland, who had quit his job. I had quit 2 jobs right before the financial crisis hit, and I was doing some consulting work for small and medium-sized businesses, doing some due diligence consulting for investors. And this guy showed up. He was a former hedge fund consultant and quit his job, moved to Oakland. We got to know each other. I did some investment work for him, and he came to me a few months after we met and said, "Hey, David, I want to start a financial services firm for the medical cannabis industry. Do you want to help?" And I said, "Sure, yeah, why not?" So we started that company in 2009. We found that the initial idea was that we would lend money to cultivators and dispensaries that really at the time didn't have any access to capital. And as we started to dig into the industry, what we quickly realized was that they needed money, but they also needed a lot of other help as well. So we ended up building a consulting arm to the business that ended up being much bigger than the financial services side. And then, in 2012, the feds started really cracking down on cannabis again. It got harder to operate in the industry. We would talk to a lot of investors, and at that time, it got difficult to tell investors that they should be putting their money in cannabis when the feds were raiding as much as they were. So my partner and I rolled up that business, and that's right around when Oaksterdam University got raided by the feds. So I came in the day after the raid and just offered to help, and me and some other dedicated folks rebooted that school. It was tough. The feds took everything. They took computers, all the curricula, all the files, everything but the furniture, essentially. So we had to restart it with like rebuilding the curricula from email records, and the hell of a time. But we got the school back on its feet, and then about a year and a half later, I ended up going to Arcview as the 3rd employee at the time.
And haven't looked back since. So what has kept you in cannabis this long? You don't have the desire to move out, or you feel just set, found like you feel like found a home in this industry?
Yeah, I I had several careers prior to this. I worked for an investment bank. I worked for an engineering consulting firm, and what I found was that while I was still learning to do my job, it was great, and I loved it, and I was super interested. But uh, as soon as I really started to understand and get good at what I was doing, felt like I had a handle on it, I would get bored really quickly. And one of the things I love about cannabis, I mean, the plant is amazing. What it does for people is amazing. Um, so there's definitely that aspect, but also everything changes in the cannabis industry so often and so dramatically that I'm always learning, right?
Mm.
I've never felt like, oh, I got it. I have a handle on everything, right? It's never gotten boring.
Man, yeah, that's for sure, and it's crazy to even think about the feds raiding a school. Just thinking back to those days, and they seem, it's not that long ago, but it seems so long ago, compared to where we're at now with recreational cannabis, like on the West Coast, almost everywhere you look, this was something that people were getting raided for left and right, less than a decade ago.
Yeah, yeah, a lot has changed in that time. The industry looks completely different today than it did when I started.
Right. And so with that change, obviously like federal legalization has been a hot topic. You and I spoke about that a couple weeks ago, and with New York legalizing, all these states coming online with recreational cannabis. What do you kind of predict is going to be the short term, or just the next year or two in this space, and then where do you kind of envision like the next maybe 3 to 5, not the long term, but kind of the short and the medium term visions of cannabis?
Sure. So it's impossible to predict exactly when federal legalization will happen, but it's it's plausible, it's conceivable that it could happen in the next year or two, and that's um, it's definitely closer than it's ever been. There's still a lot of political hurdles that we'll have to get over to get there, but when the snowball starts rolling, things can change very quickly. So um, we've got stuff like um, the States Act, uh, more more past the House, and we've got this new Booker Schumer Wyden bill that's going to be coming out soon. All of these things, I think, are just sort of socializing the idea of cannabis with Congress. It's going to take a while to get them on the same page. But when that happens, it's going to be an absolute game changer. It's going to come with a lot of good and a lot of bad. Overall, I, I've been fighting for legalization since I got into this industry, and um, it's definitely needed. There's no excuse for us to be locking people up over this plant. Um, but the industry is going to have to adjust to what federal legalization looks like, um, and also to the new players that get involved. We've already seen quite a few big businesses dip their toes in cannabis. Some do more than dip their toes after Canada legalized um, adult use, and so yeah, it's gonna be an interesting ride, certainly. In the meantime, I fully expect states to continue to legalize that. The pace of that has just been picking up. We've finally seen a bunch of states that have legalized through their legislatures. Initially, it was always through ballot initiatives,
Hmm.
but there are some states that don't have a ballot initiative process. And so it's good to see that legislators are starting to get on board and passing laws to legalize.
And do you think that's going to speed up, because obviously, like, whatever bill passes, recreation, cannabis becomes decriminalized or whatever, and then recreational cannabis is voted in, but it usually takes, a year or two for the regulations to be put in place and cannabis to actually be sold recreationally. Do you envision that process speeding up or maybe staying around the same time?
So for federal legalization, I don't think it's likely that federal legalization will just blanket legalize cannabis everywhere. I think it almost certainly whatever happens with federal legalization will leave a lot of regulation up to the states in terms of what they what they want to allow and not. Um, in terms of how quickly markets roll out, right? As states legalize, we've seen markets that have rolled out as quickly as about 6 months. That's pretty rare. Typically, it's more like a year or a year and a half. And I expect that to continue for some time. I'm hoping that we start to see more of a balance in terms of what regulations look like. So one of the really unique things about cannabis is how different the regulations are from state to state. And some states have crazy, ridiculous, burdensome regulations that make it super difficult to operate. On the other end, you have states that make it super easy and it's really wide open. And the balance is probably somewhere in between. When we see states like Oklahoma, which has medical cannabis, and essentially anyone with $2,500 can get a cannabis license. The there are too many people growing cannabis. There isn't really a lot um, in terms of quality control. So you see stuff in the Oklahoma market that should never be going to patients. Um, and I suspect that those issues will work themselves out. It reminds me in a lot of ways of California when I got started in cannabis in the really early days, where the state regulations were extremely loose, and this made it really easy to participate in the industry, which is good. We just need to make sure that I would see stuff when I got started in cannabis. I'd go into grow rooms and the people had their pit bull, shitting on the floor in the grow room, and that's not appropriate, especially when you're talking about making medicine for people. At the same time, we don't need, every square foot of a grow covered in CCTV cameras that are fed back to state regulators. We don't need seed to sale tracking. We don't need application fees that cost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So hopefully we'll start to see, as people get more comfortable with the idea of cannabis, as legislators and regulators get more comfortable with the idea of cannabis, regulations that make sense, that work, that keep people safe, but don't make it ridiculous to participate in the industry.
Right. And that's definitely, the criticism towards regulations are like places like Oklahoma or even like Oregon for recreational market allowed oversupply where businesses struggled, put a lot of investment into businesses that were just kind of deemed to struggle due to how the market was rolled out. And then you see certain states that are very restrictive of who can get involved in it. There's a lot of different conversations and factors that lead to what's inclusive or what's exclusive. So yeah, I totally see that. And so what do you like as federal legalization comes, do you feel like, I mean, it seems obvious that they're going to kind of pick and choose what worked and what didn't work from specific states. But do you feel like as that moves, will there be a blanket, all right, here's federal legalization, here's the laws that everyone needs to operate within on top of their state regulations, or you feel like it'll be more so let's just push it onto the states?
So that's a really good question. And first of all, I disagree with your statement that it's obvious that they will learn from the successes and failures of states. A lot of, unfortunately, a lot of our legislators are not good at putting in place good policy. In terms of how heavy-handed the federal regulation is likely to be, it's a good question. I mean, initially some of the stuff like the States Act essentially exempted cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act to the extent that a state had legalized, and most of the regulatory burden was on the states. I think it's unlikely that we end up with something like that. I think the feds are going to try to sort of add a regulatory layer on top of it, and we've seen some pretty unfortunate sort of trends in terms of where these legislators are moving with respect to regulation. So the latest version of the MORE Act, the version that, I guess not the latest anymore, but the version that passed in the end of 2020 it had essentially a bunch of tobacco regulation that was cut and pasted into the law, and some of it doesn't make sense for cannabis. It also had some provisions that were really, really problematic, like it said that the federal government could issue permits and that they could deny permits to people who had passed marijuana offenses, which MORE Act is supposed to be an equity bill. It's supposed to be about social equity, and Black and brown communities have been disproportionately targeted by the police. They are overwhelmingly more likely than their white counterparts to have marijuana offenses on their record. So to deny them access to the industry because of that was kind of a slap in the face. We've also got people. Dianne Feinstein is pushing for sort of a pharmaceutical inspired regulatory structure, which also just makes no sense for cannabis. That would be sort of even worse than the tobacco inspired regulation. So we'll see how all of this works itself out. I'm hoping that the feds don't add too much in the way of regulatory burden and also taxes.
Right.
We've seen what happens when markets get overtaxed. The illicit market, the unregulated market, continues to thrive, and then you have people calling for enforcement to try to deal with that. We know what cannabis enforcement looks like. That's prohibition. That's where we came from. That's what we're trying to get away from. And the answer to getting rid of the unregulated market is not arresting people. It's creating a legal market that can outcompete it. And we have other examples of this, right? Alcohol was banned during Prohibition, and when Prohibition was lifted, the industry reemerged. And during Prohibition, it was entirely run by criminals, by definition. But now, outside of a few counties in Appalachia, we don't have an illicit alcohol problem that requires enforcement, right? I could brew beer in my garage, or I can make gin in my bathtub, and if I want to do that, it's fine. Law enforcement doesn't need to get involved. I can even give it to my friends, and that's fine. But if I tried to sell it, there wouldn't be, like, nobody's going to buy my garage beer at scale. I could turn that into a business because there's a thriving alcohol market where people have all the choices they need at whatever price point, at whatever quality they're looking for. It's easy, it's accessible, and that's the way you displace the unregulated market, is you create an industry that just outcompetes it.
Right. And you touched on, right, the alcohol market, a little bit of tobacco, pharmaceuticals, and so often, not only in regulation, but just in theory of what cannabis looks like or what market to model it after, whether it's marketing or building businesses, it gets compared to these verticals. What are some of the similarities that you see between cannabis and these other verticals? And then what are some of the differences that, like you said, we need to be cautious of, not, whether it's the mindset or regulation, we need to not necessarily model it or look to this as the example? And what are some of the things that we need to look to, or not need, but can look to these other industries for examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the notable things about cannabis is it's not one thing. When you look at some of these other markets. Right? If you look at alcohol, alcohol is a liquid. It might have 5% alcohol. It might have 13% alcohol. It might have 40% alcohol, but it's always a liquid that you buy. You drink it. You get drunk. People drink because they're sad, or they drink because they want to socialize and have fun, or they drink because they're alcoholics. There are a few reasons why people drink, but it's a pretty simple product. If you look at cigarettes, right, that's a pretty simple product. If you look at coffee, that's a pretty simple product, right? You buy it, you might be able to get coffee beans or ground coffee, or just buy a coffee drink, but it's a pretty straightforward, easy thing. When you look at cannabis, what is it? Okay, it's flower that you can smoke or that you can vaporize. It's concentrates that can be in vape cartridge or that you can dab. It's topicals that you can put on your skin. It's sublingual strips. It's tinctures. It's edibles. It's beverages. And the reasons that people consume cannabis are so unbelievably varied. People consume it to deal with pain or to deal with symptoms of all manner of diseases. People consume it to relax, to deal with anxiety, to get sleep, to improve their appetite, to deal with depression, to have a good time and socialize, to be creative. And because of this, because of how versatile cannabis is, both in its uses and in its forms, taking any sort of single regulatory structure and trying to make it work for all of that is challenging. I would say that probably something that looks like alcohol regulation is if you're going to take a set of regulations to use for cannabis, something that looks similar to alcohol regulation would probably be the most appropriate. Although you'd want to make some changes where necessary to deal with the fact that cannabis isn't alcohol. It's a very different product with very different concerns.
Right, right. And so, I know when we spoke last time, just talking about, there's this big impending, the MSO is the big bad wolf to the culture, to the community of people that have been here. It's also the inevitability of a market that's maturing. um, and the difference between these MSOs and these craft brands and the price points and people being scared of being priced out. Something that you had brought up was the phrase the culture of connoisseurship last time, and how that plays a role in cannabis, and why that's something that craft brands should really take to heart, to understanding their place in the marketplace, both pricing wise, marketing wise. um, and so how do you feel like, could you explain a little bit your thoughts on just the culture of connoisseurship and how that fits in this industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll start by saying that I talk to growers all the time and have been for more than a decade, and I still hear from a lot of folks, especially in the Emerald Triangle and Northern California, people who are they're cannabis cultivators. Cannabis is their life, and they're against legalization. And I get it, right? I understand the fear they have, that when it's legal, big businesses are going to come in and push them out of the market. There's going to be no space for sort of smaller players. And in one respect, they're right. The big players are absolutely coming in, and there's nothing that we can do to stop them. And we call MSOs big players now, but MSOs are small potatoes compared to the liquor companies and the consumer packaged good companies that eventually will be involved in the space. The good news is that cannabis does have that culture of connoisseurship. And when we look at non-durable goods market, so non-durable goods are just consumable goods. So a car is a durable good and a lollipop is a non-durable good. And anytime you see a non-durable goods market that has a culture of connoisseurship, you see several features in common. So if you take wine, for example, right, wine has a super strong culture of connoisseurship around it. Um, you can buy wine from big multinationals that produce millions of cases a year. You can buy wine from local vineyards that produce hundreds or thousands of cases a year. You can buy a $2 bottle of wine. You can buy a $20,000 bottle of wine, or anything in between. And there's space for all of this to coexist in the marketplace. And that is true every time, right? So if we look at chocolate and beer are two really interesting examples, because for a long time in the 80s and 90s, there was no culture of connoisseurship around chocolate or beer. And those markets were just completely dominated by the big players, Kraft and Hershey's and Anheuser-Busch and companies like that. As the culture of connoisseurship started to reemerge around beer and chocolate in the early 2000s, we saw an explosion of microbreweries. We saw an explosion of local chocolatiers. Now, if you want to, you can still get a cheap bar of Hershey's chocolate from the grocery store, but you can also get a $30 bar of organic fair trade stone ground chocolate if you want. Tobacco is another really interesting one, because cigarettes don't have a culture of connoisseurship to speak of, right? Like, nobody's reading Cigarette Magazine, nobody's on the message boards talking about why Camels are cured better than Marlboros. And as a result, you walk into a store, you might have 50 choices of cigarettes, but they're all made by a few big multinationals. They're all the same price, plus or minus a dollar or two. But even in the smoked tobacco space, cigars do have that culture of connoisseurship, right? There's Cigar Aficionado magazine, and there's Cigar of the Month clubs, and there's cigar lounges, and people take cigars very seriously and how they're made and where they're made. And as a result, you can buy a cheap cigar or a really expensive one. You can buy a cigar from a giant company or from a small producer. So as long as the regulations around cannabis don't preclude small businesses from being involved, which they have in some states, unfortunately, right? We've seen regulations that just are not compatible with small business, where the application fees are so expensive that small businesses could never apply, or the licenses are so limited that there's just no chance for other businesses to get involved. But as long as that's not the case, it doesn't matter how many big players get involved. There will still be space for small craft producers, and it's going to change, though, right? Like, if you're really good at growing cannabis and that's all you're good at, well, you can, in sort of this future post legalization world, you can be someone's employee growing cannabis, or you can learn the other parts of the business that you need to understand in order to thrive in this new reality. Or you can partner with people who are good at branding, who are good at business administration and management, who are good at marketing, because those are all necessary skills in this post legalization world.
Right. Right. And I think that's important for people to get, to keep in mind, because I feel like as legalization comes, people spend so much energy fighting the inevitable, when, to take it just to music, for example, when like streaming came on, like music labels spent millions of dollars fighting the inevitable instead of like just getting on the wagon and monetizing it to this new reality. They fought the inevitable, and that paved the way for Spotify or Apple, people that came up that should have been Sony or Warner, should have owned those companies, but they didn't. They didn't have the foresight or the ability to pivot. And I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's something that people should just keep in mind, and the importance of building market share now. While it's even as competitive as it is, it's exponentially less expensive and difficult to compete in today's market than it's going to be 2 years from now, let alone 5 to 10 years from now.
Absolutely. And look, I get it, right? Like, there are people, I have friends who are growers and their parents were growers, and they for generations, they have known a thing that has made them a living. Unfortunately, that thing was built in a construct of prohibition that is the result of just an unbelievable amount of pain and suffering, and economic hardship and incarceration and death for so many people. And that's changing. And it can be hard to adjust to a new reality, but you can adjust to a new reality. And when you look at what the future of cannabis looks like, it's going to be different from what the past was. But that doesn't mean that there isn't space for people who really are interested in participating.
Yeah, I love that. It doesn't mean that there's not space. I think that's important for people to keep in mind. Is there anything that sticks out to you? I mean, this is a very broad question, but anything that sticks out to you that like MSOs or what we view as big business now can learn from the craft companies, or what the craft companies can learn from the MSOs?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely lessons on both sides, but one of the things that we see sort of outside of cannabis is big companies are good at all sorts of things. They can produce things at scale, they can produce things cheaply, they can distribute things quickly and broadly. What big brands are bad at is authenticity, making a real, authentic connection with craft consumers. So we've seen Budweiser try to launch craft beers and they fall flat. People don't like them. Big companies just have a terrible track record of being able to authentically tell a story, right? Tell a story about a founder of a brand, or tell a story about the handmade process that goes into making a product, or something like that. And so in other industries, what big brands do is they wait for these smaller craft producers to create a brand that really resonates with consumers. And eventually, when it gets enough traction, the big brand will come in and buy it. And inevitably, over the course of the next couple of years, it will lose that shine and that authenticity that it had when it was a small craft brand, and the big brand will just go and buy another one. And this creates opportunities for people to generate real wealth. If you can create a cannabis brand that really resonates with people, you can make money just selling that craft brand to people, selling it to customers. But also potentially there's a big exit for you if you get it right. There are people who will want to acquire that company from you, and could be acquiring it for an amount of money that means that you get to decide whatever you want to do next with your life. So that's what the small players need to lean into, is authenticity, forming a deep connection with their customers, making their customers feel special for consuming their products, right? That's what the big brands really struggle with, and that's where the smaller players can find an edge.
Yeah, I've seen here in Washington, I've seen a lot of people that kind of lucked out winning a license lottery and being the first or the only store in a specific area, and just talking to owners, oh, the weed sells itself. I don't need to worry. I don't need to worry about it. The weed sells itself. And it's like, well, you're kind of benefiting from supply and demand, and not necessarily the weed selling itself, because things are going to look, again, exponentially different every couple years. So I think that's something, I think for just the smaller companies out there who might not have the bigger vision or foresight or understanding, I think that's something for them to keep in mind, is that authenticity and really connecting with people is important. It's not, this isn't just you're not just a 7-Eleven selling cigarettes and gas and you just happen to be on the corner and that's going to be fine, because eventually, there's going to be a store across the street and there's going to be a store kitty corner from you, and they might come in and connect with that community at a much, much higher level than you. And so I think that's definitely something that brands need to keep in mind.
Yeah.
And it's crazy. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Something that smaller producers can learn from MSOs and these bigger producers is, well, one, it's imperative that you follow, that you know what's happening in regulation, right? You understand what the regulations are, what you can and can't do, and that you keep an eye on how that's likely to change, because these things change. New laws get passed, new regulations get put in place, and so compliance is a big one. Understanding how to be compliant under whatever regulations exist in your state and your city and your county. And some of those regulations are terrible, and that's part of doing business right now in some places. And then also process and producing efficiently, right? Like a small producer is never going to get their cost of production down to what some of these really big producers can do. I mean, I've seen cannabis cultivations that can pump out decent quality cannabis at $350, $400 a pound. And if you're a small grower, you're never going to get your costs down that low. But you do need to get your costs down um, uh, as low as you can and still maintain the kind of product that you want to produce, because there are a lot of people competing in this market, and if someone else can squeeze you on margins, that could put you out of business. I do think that we'll see a lot of change in the way consumers approach cannabis, and we're already starting to see that. Cannabis consumers are still coming from a very prohibition mindset, where when they're shopping for cannabis, they're looking at like an edible's price per milligram, or in flower price per percentage point, right? They want the strongest cannabis they can find at the lowest cost. And that's just not how, right? That's how consumers in illicit drug markets shop. Mm-hmm. That's not how consumers in most markets shop. So if you look at alcohol, right? There are a few consumers who just want the strongest alcohol they can get for the lowest price. But most consumers, that's not what they're looking for, right? They're looking for something that tastes the way they want it to taste, or that the brand has the story they connect with, or they like the label or the bottle, right? Or that's the thing that their friends drink. Mm-hmm. Coffee is another one, right? Like people, there was a time when like good coffee meant strong coffee, right? Weak coffee was bad, strong coffee was good. The stronger it is, the better it is. But that's not the world we live in. Consumers aren't just trying to get the strongest coffee they can get their hands on. They are shopping for coffee with all sorts of other considerations. Where did it come from? Is it fair trade? Is it convenient? Is it easy? Do I like the taste? Do I like the fact that it comes from Starbucks, or do I like the fact that it comes from my local, corner coffee shop that has a slam poetry night once a month? And so we're starting to see cannabis consumers sort of refine the reasons that they're purchasing cannabis to include a broader set of considerations. And we're seeing things like Can is a good example. Can is a cannabis beverage. It's low dose. I think it's 2 milligrams of THC per can, right. And so no one's buying it because it's the strongest cannabis they can get for the price. They're buying it because they love the packaging, or they love the taste, or they love the fact that it's low dose, and that's what they're looking for. They love the fact that they can drink, 3 or 4 of them, and so the market is going to continue to evolve as consumers start to become more sophisticated about why they choose cannabis products.
Right. And that just leads way for more brands to coexist, because each brand can own its own positioning, rather than, like you said, there's only going to be, if you want the strongest THC, eventually there's only going to be so many brands that can compete for it, just like cola, there's Pepsi and there's Coke. you can't have 35 brands competing to be cola. There's, a couple colas, and then there's, Sprite, the anti-cola, and then there's a couple other things. And that as the industry matures, that's a great thing for brands, because there's just more opportunities to own different lanes and cut a brand out, like you said, around something different that consumers can connect to, other than just weed selling itself.
Yeah, I mean, look at alcohol or look at coffee, right? These are uh, the two most popular drugs in the United States, and there are so many. Right, there's every time I walk into a liquor store, I see a brand of alcohol that I've never seen before. There, there are big companies, there are small companies, there's companies doing weird stuff, putting all kinds of different flavors. There are companies playing with liqueur and all sorts of different alcohol percentages. Coffee, there are the time that it was, Folgers and UBAN was the choice of coffee is long behind us. And even though there are some big dominant players that sell a huge volume, they sell a ton of coffee, there's still all sorts of little unique boutique retailers and brands. And people flock to those, and they're willing to pay a premium for what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example, because like even as established as coffee is, I live in Seattle. I mean, Starbucks is global. It's like I could literally throw a rock and hit a Starbucks, over here. But there's still new coffee places popping up in this highly mature, highly competitive market. And a newer coffee place just opened up not too far from me, and it's way more expensive than Starbucks, and it's even in the middle of a pandemic, it's thriving, because there's just other elements of their brand, their shop, and their offerings that you're not going to get at a Starbucks. And that's a perfect thing, I think, for brands to keep in mind, is just being different and owning those channels. And I want to back it up for half a second and just talk about, you brought up Can. I was, very impressed with their beverage. I think they're the number one beverage in California by sales
That
volume. I think for at least
that
quarter
that
one
sounds
this
right.
year, I think is what I saw in a headset report. But they started in like mid 2019, so in under 2 years, they completely owned a channel. Do you have any thoughts of like what they did to own like to really carve out that hold on that channel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a few things. One, the founder of Ken comes from a CPG background. He has a lot of experience in mainstream markets, creating brands that resonate with consumers. Their design is fantastic. They made a really good looking product. Um, Also, they went into a category, beverage, the cannabis beverage category, that is small. Like, there's a lot of excitement about beverages, and ever since Constellation Brands put $4 billion into canopy growth in Canada a few years ago, there's been tons of investment in cannabis beverages, but it's still a really small market. I mean, even in mature states, cannabis beverages are something like maybe two, right? 1.5% of cannabis sales. So when you find sort of a market like this, there are a lot of big players that aren't getting involved in beverages because it feels too small for them.
Mm.
But if you can go in and dominate that market, it doesn't feel small anymore, right? If you can be the biggest fish in that small pond, that's big. They work with folks who understand things like distribution logistics, and that's one of the big bottlenecks for cannabis beverages. If you Most cannabis products, right? If you're talking about flower, vape cartridges, edibles, most of them are small. They're light. Uh, Most of them don't need any sort of special like refrigeration. Beverages have a lot of challenges. Beverages are big comparatively. They take up a lot of space, right? If you want to stock a store with cannabis beverages. It takes up just a lot of physical room. They're very heavy. It's hard to move around large quantities of liquid. A lot of the beverages come in glass bottles. Glass bottles are logistically more challenging than most of the things that cannabis businesses have to deal with. So understanding, right? And Ken doesn't need to know everything about beverage distribution logistics. They just need to know who they need to partner with,
Right.
who understands beverage distribution logistics to make that work. And I think that's a really important lesson is you need to really, really deeply understand your business and understand it on a level that most people will never think about.
Right.
So I think that's one of those are some of the things that Ken really did right, and also frankly offering a low dose product. There's a pent up demand for low dose cannabis products, and they don't sell as well overall as high dose products,
Right.
which is why so few people make them. But there are a lot of consumers, especially new consumers, who want something low dose. They're not looking to get as high as they can be,
Right.
and maybe their tolerance is lower. They're looking for something easy and manageable and not intimidating. And I think Ken hit that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. That was something I was impressed with their marketing rollout of, I've seen a lot of companies come to us for, whether it's consulting advice, and that's the Canna Curious, that lower dose thing is what a lot of people want to go after or talk about going after. Not a lot of people have done it. Not a lot of, even less people have been successful at it. And I think Can did a really good job coming out with a product that had that familiarity and the look and the appeal to just, normalize beverages. But then also, I think they did a really, really good job communicating that it was low dose. Like I even saw Ellen, I don't know if they paid her or not, but like Ellen brought it up, and just even in her pitch, she was like, oh, I was drinking a weed beverage last night, but it only had 2 milligrams, it's anyone can drink that. And I was like, I hope they gave her the script. If not, she just came up with like the perfect influencer marketing pitch. But their messaging, whether it was super manufactured or not, it cut through, unlike any other messaging I've seen around any cannabis product. I was really impressed with that, the rollout.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, marketing is tough in the cannabis industry. A lot of marketing channels that most businesses rely on are just not available to cannabis companies. I mean, the fact that companies like Facebook and Google have policies against cannabis advertising makes life challenging. And
Right.
then the advertising regulations vary from state to state and sometimes even city to city, what you can and can't do. So cannabis companies need to be creative when they think about how to reach consumers, how to market to consumers.
And so that leads to another question is, as we move towards a more mature market, federal legalization, do you feel like those platforms are going to at some point be, I wouldn't say quite say open arms, but accepting of that? Or do you kind of anticipate it to maybe even be stricter than what it is now, but at least somewhat defined? Because it's pretty vague.
I expect that things will loosen up. I certainly hope so. I mean, it's absurd to me that there are places that you can put uh, an ad for vodka that you can't put an ad for cannabis. That makes no sense. On the one hand, you have one of the most dangerous drugs in America that results in huge numbers of deaths. And don't get me wrong, alcohol can be great. It can be great, and it can be terrible, and it can be devastating, and it can destroy people's lives. Um, if you can advertise alcohol, you definitely should be able to advertise cannabis. It's such a it's cannabis is not 100% without harm, but its harms are so much smaller than alcohol or tobacco that it shouldn't even be in the same ballpark. So yeah, I do think that eventually advertising will open up a little bit more, and we'll start to be able to use some of the more traditional marketing channels that other businesses have access to.
That's a good outlook. So I want to take another step back and bring it back a little bit to the Arcview Group. You guys, as a collective, are very well known in the cannabis space for advising, consulting, investments. What are some of the things that make a company attractive to you guys? That somebody that you guys want to work with or help, or what are some of the criteria that you guys look at that makes something valuable to come into your guys' circle?
Sure. So we actually have a family of companies now at the Arcview Group. So we've got the Arcview Group, which is the parent company, and then we've got Arcview Capital, which is a FINRA and SEC licensed broker dealer. So they really go out and help companies raise capital in a very hands-on way, and they do equity crowdfunding. They help with M&A stuff, IPOs, things like that. So they're looking for really strong cannabis companies that they can that they can really sell to large investors. There's Arcview Ventures, which is a member managed venture fund, and they're really just looking for good, strong cannabis investment opportunities. They want to see a solid business plan. They want to see good traction. They want to see a great management team. That's one of the most important things. And then on the consulting side, we're looking for companies that are looking for strategic help. So we work across medical and adult use cannabis, hemp, CBD, and other hemp-derived cannabinoids, as well as industrial hemp, so grain and fiber. And we help companies with just all sorts of problems. So we help companies assess multi-state expansion strategies and prioritize where they're going to go next and what that looks like, right? There are a lot of different ways you can enter a new market, and some ways are better for some businesses than others. We help businesses create really compelling investment materials and prepare for capital raises. We help companies evaluate verticals. So we helped a large company that was looking at acquiring a hemp genetics company. They needed to understand the hemp genetics space, right? They needed to understand what's the potential for differentiated hemp genetics. What does the market look like today? What's the market? How's that going to evolve? What does the market for hemp genetics look like 5 years from now? So that they could determine whether the valuation of the company that they were looking to acquire was reasonable. We help companies prepare for federal legalization. Not enough cannabis companies are starting to think about how the changes that come along with federal legalization are likely to affect their businesses. Things like interstate commerce, right? If you're a cannabis company in California and you can produce really high quality, low cost cannabis, maybe the prospect of being able to send that cannabis to other states is a potential opportunity for you. If you're a cultivator in Maine growing cannabis that you'll never get the cost of production down to what folks can get in states that are better suited to growing plants, that could be a really big threat to your business. For ancillary companies, right? If you're a cannabis HR services provider, probably you've got some space in the market to operate because the mainstream HR companies either are sitting on the sidelines and don't want to work with cannabis companies, or they don't understand the sort of specific regulatory concerns of cannabis companies well enough. But in a post-federal legalization world, if you're offering cannabis HR services, you better have a plan for what that's going to look like, and how you're either going to sell to the big mainstream established HR companies, or how you're going to hold your ground against them, how you're going to compete with them. Payment services, we see, right, companies that offer cashless payment solutions, and there's space for that in the market because cannabis companies have a hard time with bank accounts and credit card processing. That's no longer going to be true in a post-legalization world, and that could change even sooner with something like safe banking. So these companies really need to start to assess what their position is, and we help them think through all of these things and build strategies to position themselves to not only survive but to thrive as the market continues to change.
And so for you guys, I mean, I don't know if it's something you can share. And obviously there's multiple arms, and within those arms, a broad spectrum. But what do you feel like is your guys' kind of, are you guys focused on and working in more of the emerging markets, a higher percentage in there, or more of the established markets, or is it a real healthy mix of both?
It's a real healthy mix. We work across markets. We even work internationally. Yeah, we're really here to leverage all of our years of experience, all of our market research, our access to data through our data partnerships to help cannabis companies and companies that are interested in participating in one way or another in the cannabis or hemp space to help them survive. So yeah, if it's a new licensee or a new license applicant in New York that's looking to submit a license application when that opens up, that's great. And if it's an operator that is operating in California and they're looking to expand their brand, add different product categories, expand into new states, just better understand their consumers, who their consumers are, what those consumers' behaviors are. We help them. So yeah, we don't have on the consulting side, we don't have a favorite kind of cannabis company. And then on the investment side, I mean, I don't want to speak for my colleagues on that side of the business, but they're just looking for really strong companies that are a great opportunity. And if that's in California, great. And if that's in Maryland, great.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, now with you guys having all these different divisions, you're definitely all over the board helping people in various aspects. What is the main thing that you feel like you really want people to take away about the Arcview Group? What do you guys want to be positioned as, known as? I mean, obviously, again, it's broad because there's different arms of the business, but is there like a singular mission that you feel like you guys are kind of rallied behind?
Yeah, I mean, the Arcview Group was started by Troy Dayton and Steve D'Angelo, really to help legalize cannabis. They recognized that business was one of the most powerful platforms for social change, and that if we wanted to push this legalization forward, we needed to be able to leverage business and leverage capital to make that happen. It's really a company rooted in a love of the plant and a love of activism and the community that this plant creates. Another thing that I want people to take away is the importance of social equity. We haven't really touched on that very much, but it's hard to overstate how much worse the war on drugs has been on certain communities, Black and brown communities, and it's time for us to figure out how to make sure that the new legal industry that we're creating is inclusive for everyone. Even though that people are coming from places where they might not have the same access to capital, to networks, to education that other folks have. So we're working on solving that. The name Arcview actually comes from a Martin Luther King quote, which was the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Mm.
Um, so on the Arcview Capital side, they're really working on new ways to create non-predatory funding opportunities for social equity licensees. We just actually announced a new course that we put together with Oaksterdam University to help educate people about the cannabis fundraising landscape. This is something that's been sort of bouncing around in my head for a long time, and I'm really excited that I was able to bring Arcview and Oaksterdam together to do this. The course is really designed so that when you start to go out to try to raise capital for a cannabis business, you won't be lost in the conversations that investors are having, that business partners are having. So you understand what private equity is and what venture capital is. You understand what a Series A round is and what a convertible note is, right? Like there's all this jargon in the investment community, and if you're not part of that, if you don't have a history and a background in that, it can be really overwhelming and disorienting. So this course is really designed to help people get up to speed on what all of these things mean, and hopefully put them in a really good place to be able to navigate the waters. Because if you want to have a successful cannabis business, chances are at some point you're going to have to raise some money. So.
Man, I love that. That's something like, I think one of the misconceptions or stigmas of, in this space, right, with big business as opposed to just craft, the culture, whatever. Whenever people think of investment or big business, they get a little leery of people being in it for the wrong reasons. But in every conversation I've had with you and everything I've talked to you about, it's like you guys are just really like rooted in the complete opposite of that, in the mission, the purpose, so many of the things that you guys are doing. And I just think that that's just really interesting, and I think that's a good thing for the community out there to understand that resources like you guys, and I mean the multitude of resources you guys have, is not everything is here to take advantage of someone or to just push this big agenda of profits over whatever and kick everyone to the curb. That, from everything you spoke about, and a lot of just the gems that, if anyone is listening, are rooted in giving power to, not necessarily the smaller person, but the person that really wants to carve out and make a name in this industry, regardless of where they come from or their financial backing. It's really about building with the tools that you have, and then leveraging that to get to the next level, and leveraging that to get to the next level. And a big part of that is mentorship, education, collaboration, and partnerships. And it seems like you guys are just kind of touching all sides of that spectrum. And I think that's really unique.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, people's concerns about that are real, right? There are people who are in this who don't have a good moral foundation. There are people who are predatory, who are out to take advantage of people. There are companies with terrible business practices. So it's really important, right, that you understand that those people, that those companies exist. But it's not everyone, right? And it's not all big businesses. There are a bunch of unscrupulous, terrible operators of all sizes in cannabis. The finance industry, the investment industry. Look, I've spent a lot of time in the mainstream finance industries. In a lot of ways, that culture is toxic, right? It's a toxic culture that values money to the exclusion of other considerations. So it's important that people understand that and go into situations with their eyes open. But yeah, not everyone not everyone's bad. Not all investors are bad. I have a lot of real close friends who are investors who are in it for the love of the plant, for the social change. They want to find real business partners and help them thrive. So that's out there too.
Yeah, that is awesome, man. That is beautiful. So before we get you out, is there anything else that you'd like to plug? You know, the music artists we get on here, you know, throwing out Instagrams and all that. I don't know if that's your speed, but is there anything else that you just like to plug, or want people to know where people can find you? If you want people to find you, you might want to stay hidden. That's your prerogative.
Yeah, I mean, you can find us at arcviewconsulting.com or arcviewgroup.com. If you've got a cannabis business and you're looking for help, we'd love to hear from you. We put out all sorts of content. We've got educational webinars that happen on a regular basis. We get some of the brightest minds in cannabis together and have some really substantive conversations that folks can learn a lot from. We've got our market research division, Arcview Market Research, with all sorts of reports about the cannabis industry if you're just looking to learn and get a baseline understanding of what that looks like. So yeah, definitely don't be a stranger. Reach out to us and enjoy this cannabis journey. It is not an easy industry to be in, but it is a really rewarding and fulfilling industry to be in.
Awesome, man. I love that, David. Thank you for joining us today, man. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, man. I'll talk to you later.
Bye.
All right, guys, that was David Abernathy with the Arcview Group. Super stoked to have him on this podcast. We had a chat with him for an article a couple weeks ago, and it was just one of those conversations that was so insightful that I really wanted to get him on this podcast, because me and him just did it over Zoom. And while the article's coming out with some quotes in there was just so many gems that I felt guilty hoarding to myself and just wanted to share with other people. So super stoked to have him on here. You know, a couple of the takeaways that I got there. One of the, I mean, there's a lot of takeaways from there, but one of the biggest takeaways was in talking about the difference between MSO or big business and cannabis and craft cannabis. These are two things that have been clashing since the dawn of the talk of legalization. And like we spoke about in this conversation, a definite inevitability in the direction of any industry, you know, in commerce. But one of the things he said was that, you know, big businesses do process and systems and the details really, really well. And that's something that the small brands, small businesses can take from. I mean, obviously a smaller brand's not going to have the budget or the personnel or potentially the experience from other industries to necessarily compete at the same level, but to strive towards getting your SOPs tight, your processes tight, your team tight, just certain things that big business does really well, just to strive to do on a small level. And then for the small businesses that are worried about big businesses coming in, you know, the big businesses, like he mentioned, have a really, really hard time authentically connecting with the consumer. A lot of people buy Bud Light or Coors Light, you know, in the beer market simply because of the cost. There's definitely some marketing aspects to it, but people don't necessarily connect to that at the level that they do with craft brands. You know, craft things are people just deeper connections, more connection points. We obviously talk a lot about music. So in the music space, you know, the independent artist usually is going to have the rabid fan base that will wait overnight, you know, spend an exorbitant amount of money on merchandise from these artists. They might have less fans, but their fans are usually at a much higher, just a higher connection to the said artist, as opposed to, you know, mainstream artists can pack out stadiums. But if you look at the majority of those fans, they're just there because their friends there. They're just there because it's hype. It's an artist they hear on the radio. They're not as just invested in that artist as independent artists. And so when it comes to record labels have a hard, you know, they can't just manufacture connections with people. They can't manufacture authenticity. They have to find artists that already have something like that going, sign them, and give them a greater platform, distribution, budget, and processes to get them out into the world. Very similar, we were talking about in cannabis, as craft brands build up their audience, there's an exit strategy for big businesses that are unable to connect with people or geo-specific areas the way a craft brand can. But a big business can come in and buy that business out and distribute it and bring it to a higher level. So it's just the connections between music and cannabis run so deep on so many levels. Um, and then one of the other biggest takeaways from that conversation and my previous conversation with David was just the phrase culture of connoisseurship. It's something that I'm aware of in, from just marketing, from books, and a process of just being a marketer. But it's something that he brought up some points that I just hadn't quite, the dots hadn't been fully connected till our first conversation. And so I just think it's something important to understand when we're modeling this industry off of other industries, is understanding that this industry has a wider array of uses, in both the ways you can consume and the reasons that you consume. And it also has a culture of connoisseurship where people love things for different reasons and connect to things for different reasons, and price point doesn't always necessarily matter. As we move towards this impending national legalization and really scaled out cannabis, there's going to be $8 eighths of potentially decent weed out there, where these craft brands are selling 45, in Washington at least $45 eighths, and in California it might be 55 to 75. But these higher priced eighths, that those people are already squeezing pennies out of those jars as it is now. When it comes to federal legalization, without increasing their cultivation facility massively, it's going to be hard for them to squeeze the margins that a facility, a producer that has, you know 4 million square feet of canopy. You're just going to be able to produce a product at a much cheaper price than someone that has, you know 40,000 square feet, which is large by today's standards, but even 14,000 square feet. Just the price of goods is going to be exponentially different between those two things, but both can coexist in this market. As he mentioned, looking at wine, there's wine that is $20,000 per bottle, and there's wine that's a couple dollars per bottle, and both of them move units to different consumers for different reasons. They can sit in the same store without people coming in and be like, oh, this cheap wine ruined all the expensive wine, I don't want it anymore. Consumers are going to want different products for different reasons. So it's just something I think is important for smaller and craft brands to wrap their head around as they move in building their brand and building their audience. And something that I've been preaching for years and will always preach, whether asked for or not, is today is the cheapest and easiest it will ever be to take market share in this industry. Tomorrow will be harder than today. The next day will be harder than today. And it'll also be more expensive every single day. So I urge all of my friends, colleagues, other brands out there that are in craft, that are in this for the right reasons, that are in this for quality. I'm not telling you to sell yourself out on your packaging or go all in on influencers or market or any specific thing. But please, please, please heed these words. Take market share aggressively now while it is cheaper and easier, because it's going to be exponentially harder in 3 years and astronomically harder in 10 years. So go after that now. Really appreciate everyone tuning in with us today. Big shout out to David again for coming through. Yeah, we'll be back next Wednesday. You can find this episode on Spotify, YouTube, the various channels where podcasts are out. Thank you guys very much. Joey's not here. He always says something about love you guys. So I'll say that for you guys. Love you guys. Peace.